Sure.
We're rolling.
All right. So if you could just tell us your name and your job title.
Okay. My name is Sharon Bischoff. I'm the Mountain Region Biologist with North Carolina State Parks.
And where exactly are we right now?
So we are in South Mountain State Park, which is about just under 20 miles south of Morganton, North Carolina. And we're up on the Chestnut Knob Ridge, very close to the Chestnut Knob Overlook, and not that far from the origin of the Chestnut Knob fire that occurred in 2016.
So when the Chestnut Knob fire happened, what was your initial reaction?
Reaction. Our initial reaction when the fire started was a direct attack, instant deployment of park staff and local volunteer firefighters and first responders to try and get to the fire and put it out immediately. But it was a unprecedented fire season in 2016, and so we realized that that direct attack was not going to be enough to stop the fire. It would jump over fire lines that we installed, and so with more and more resources as the fire grew, we were able to kind of step back and get stronger lines that would actually hold. And so the fire grew to a larger size, but we were able to defend those lines and actually put it out and have it completely contained.
And so like when people usually think about wildfires, usually we think about like destruction and like massiveness, but in what ways can fires be good?
There are a lot of ways that fires can be good. When we look about or talk about wildfires especially, there is that perspective of devastation and destruction, and certainly as it relates to people, it is a disaster. But in terms of the forest and forest ecology, fire is critical. It's a natural process, just like the rain is in a forest. And so to have fire in the forest is really critical for a lot of plants and animals to survive and ecosystems to persist without fire. We have quite a few plants and animal species that are imperiled now because we have suppressed fire for quite some time in the forest.
And I know for some of these reasons, that's why parks do prescribed fires.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any differences for the ecosystem on a prescribed fire versus a wildfire?
Absolutely. So there are definitely a lot of differences between a prescribed fire and a wildfire. Not only from the way there's a response and how we approach the fire, but also on the landscape, the effects in the forest as well. So when we look at it from a manager's perspective of fire, wildfire, it is an active direct response after the event has started, and there are usually much more costs involved. It is extremely expensive to fight a wildfire. It's much more dangerous to the firefighter staff that are trying to put the fire out because it's usually in much more extreme weather conditions and in a time when we would not start a fire intentionally. Prescribed fire, for some prescribed fire units, and sometimes it's referred to as controlled burns or planned burns, it's all the same concept. But what we do, we have a lot of scientists and researchers that we rely on to understand fire behavior, and there is a tremendous amount of planning and work up front, months to even sometimes years, depending on how complex a burn unit is, where we are working out all the logistics and the details to make sure we understand how we are expecting the fire to behave in that unit, whether it's the terrain, the fuel loads, which would be the leaf litter and the duff on the forest floor. And then we also have to consider all the weather conditions, and that is critical. We have to have everything line up, the temperature, the wind speed, the wind direction, the humidity, all of that has to be just right, and then we can light the fire for a prescribed burn. And so there's a lot that goes into planning for a prescribed burn, and it is much safer for the firefighters that are conducting the burn. It's much safer for all the community around, outside of where the burn unit is. The smoke load is much lower. There's always smoke with a fire, but when it's a prescribed burn, The particulates there are much less particulates in the air quality is much less affected, and we do have regulations, air quality regulations, that we abide by when we conduct prescribed burns. A wildfire, all of that goes out the window, and it is much worse, and so prescribed burn is always the way to go. Much better for us from a human perspective, and then also from an ecological perspective, it's much better for the forest. It's not these extremes of intense fire behavior on the landscape, which some trees are adapted to handle extreme fire behavior, but not all are. And so with a prescribed burn, we are able to have a lower intensity. No, oh, okay.
And we are rolling?
Okay.
What were some of the immediate benefits of the chestnut knob fire on the ecosystem?
So some of the immediate benefits that we saw right after the chestnut knob wildfire was really the mosaic, the difference across the landscape. The fire did what, as a researcher, we would expect it to do in this landscape with humans not involved, which is ideal, of course. The fire rolled up ridges and burned intensely up over ridge tops, and if you can look around here and see, there are major fire scars, and you can see the fire was intense here, and it blew through the tree canopy. But, as we'll talk about in a little bit, you'll see that these trees are prepared for that. They've spent thousands of years with fire behaving in that way, and so they can shrug it off or get the next generation ready. And that's what they're waiting for up on these ridge tops, is an intense fire to start the next generation of the forest. And then we also saw in some of the lower valleys and ravines, in 2016 we had a severe drought, and so fire burned into those ravines more than would be typical, but even so, even on north-facing slopes and in the ravines, the fire would slow down and it was less intense because of the moisture and just the aspect of the landscape. And that is what is typical, and that's what we want to see from a land manager standpoint. We don't want the impact of a fire to be just one piece all the way across the landscape. We want that mosaic where things are different in different places that really boosts diversity for the forest, and that's ideal, and that's what we saw immediately after the fire was contained, and it's only increased since then in the last 2 years.
Could you maybe give us just a brief overview, because we'll go into this in detail later, but of some of the specific types of fauna, flora, and maybe even animals that benefited after the fire?
Okay. So
one thing to be aware of is, as we're going to talk about eventually or something, we don't know, and we don't know how it's going to go together, and avoid, as I said before,
or as we're going to see soon.
as we're going to see soon.
oh,
we
right,
just don't
because
know.
you don't know how it's
We
going to
don't
piece
know how
together.
it's-
That's
yeah,
right.
sorry.
Right.
That's good.
Okay.
That's great.
Okay,
This
sorry.
is great.
Okay. So some plants and animals that directly benefited from the fire moving through this landscape. Really, wildlife benefit as a whole, if I can use such a broad brush to say that, because after a wildfire moves through, or any fire moves through a landscape, there's a flush of herbaceous plants on the forest floor. Lots of lower growing plants, and it increases the diversity of those plants, and they produce fruits and nuts and all sorts of food sources and tender shoots. It's a great food source for wildlife. And so often, even after prescribed burns or wildfires, we'll see as soon as the fire moves through, songbirds will move into the burned area, even within the same day sometimes, and they're scrounging on the forest floor looking for insects that have been uncovered in the leaf litter. And so it's instantaneous, the animals that can benefit from this once the fire has gone through. And the plants the plants that benefit, there are a whole host, like I mentioned, on the forest floor. There are lots of herbaceous plants that regenerate quickly and even more lusciously than they would if there was no fire, like blueberries and laurels, and lots of wildflowers, as well as tree species. Plenty of oaks and pine trees really benefit also and are well adapted to fire moving through their ecosystem.
And then, do any of the wildfire retardants that were used to control the fire, do those have any effect on any of the?
Did we have planes going over this one? We did have planes. Okay.
On the far end.
On the far end. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know how many times they came through, but it was one evening.
One evening they did.
If they didn't catch it then,
Okay.
it was going to get much worse.
Okay.
So they called them the big tankers.
Okay.
As far as how many times they come through,
Mhm.
I'm not sure about that. I wasn't on that line.
I don't know. Okay. I don't know. We can ask Thomas about that. He'll know more about the fire retardant that they use in the tankers.
They did drop it on that slope.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any?
You know, maybe we could go and do the show and tell now.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask. Is there anything else specifically about the fire that you wanted to talk about that I didn't touch
Oh,
on?
yeah. So do you want me to give some of the kind of the regional information of what happened during that season and just how many fires there were and kind of conditions that lined that up? Would that be
Do you
beneficial?
guys, I think we might be able to get that information from like Thomas and Jonathan.
Okay.
So I think we're good.
Good.
On that.
Okay.
Thank
If
you.
you've got it, then we don't need to
I
say it
think we're
again.
good. Yeah, I think we can.
Just like a
Let's
couple.
not stop.
Oh.
Yeah, Rob had. Why don't you talk to Manali?
Yeah. So just like so asking about like what maybe caused it. Asking to maybe go through like the time frame of recovery, talking through like scales of time.
Okay.
And like like the plants coming back and how what that looks like in like different ways, and then also like if maybe like in her reaction she talked about
Okay, so you can prep these answers in advance.
Perfect. Oh, I was mortified. No, just kidding.
We're rolling.
Okay.
Do you know what caused the fire?
We don't have a formal confirmation on what started the Chestnut Knob fire, but we do know it was human caused. There were no storms rolling through, that sort of thing, to lightning to ignite it. There are no campfires or campsites near the place of origin, so we can rule that out fairly confidently. But other than that, we don't know the specific cause, but we know it was human caused, as many were during that time frame of just really dry conditions. So even the smallest of a spark would have started something.
And then could you go over maybe the timeline of recovery of the different species after the fire?
I might not have specifics for that. Lance.
It's like the question I was thinking about, like obviously there's like a first wave of plants that come back, and then like other like there's like kind of like almost like stages to it. Like can you
Yeah.
talk about like time scales of that. and,
Sure.
Like, those different like waves of like there's like the initial
Succession.
colonies and
Yeah. Okay. So how do I want to start that?
Why don't you rephrase the question, Manali, so Sharon can answer you.
Okay. So can you talk about the waves of regeneration that happened after the fire?
Okay. Yeah, so immediately after the fire passed through, there were a series of successions of plants regenerating. Instantly, everything was black, but within not too long, the next growing season, which would have been springtime, the fire was fully contained in December, so just a few months later. Then we got that initial flush of herbaceous plants on the ground that really come back in a flurry because of all the nutrients that were pushed back into the soil from the fire. And so it boosted all of those herbaceous plants like blueberries and laurels. They just, and wildflowers, they came back in a hurry. And also we saw a series of very small seedlings and resprouting of oaks and lots of trees that were here. Also the seedlings of the pines were popping up like crazy, again, from that flush of nutrients. And so they started that first growing season in the spring and kind of got going. And now 2 years later, you can see there's they've continued growing and are in their second year, much more established, and there's even more wildflowers than a year ago, that first growing season. Did I get it? Okay.
And then,
Oh, you've got one more?
yeah, one more
okay,
question. And then, as a biologist, could you just talk about what your own experience and feelings were like as you saw this regeneration after the fire?
Okay, as a biologist, seeing the regeneration immediately in that first growing season and now in the second year after the fire is really exciting. It's something you always learn about and know that it happens, but when you get to see it time and time again, it's kind of like seeing old friends. It's really exciting to see and kind of validating, and not something that we were ever concerned that the forest would not be okay, because it's adapted for this for thousands of years, but it's always nice to see, and like I said, kind of see old friends again.
Great. Okay.
All right.
We're rolling?
So, can you talk to us about the Table Mountain pine and what the burning of that led to?
So we're on a ridgetop that burned very intensely during the Chestnut Knob fire, and the natural community that is common on these dry, high ridgetops is a pine oak heath community.
Why don't we start again?
Okay, yeah. Okay, ready?
Yep.
Okay.
Re-ask the question, Manal.
Oh, okay. So, can you talk to us about the Table Mountain pine and what the burning of these pines led to?
So we're on the ridge. One more
Deep
time.
breath, no big deal. Just words. As I said before. Oh, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Okay.
Here we go.
You ready? Okay. So we're on this high, dry ridgetop, which is characterized by a natural community called a pine oak heath natural community. The tree species that occur up here are often chestnut oak, scarlet oak, Table Mountain pine, pitch pine. And what we have here is a Table Mountain pine that was alive during the Chestnut Knob fire. But as I said, it was very intense fire behavior that rolled up this ridgetop. And so this tree is adapted to survive. If not the individual tree, its species will survive intense fire behavior. And one of its key adaptations are these pine cones. They are in close to the tree branch, as you can see here, and they're heavily armored, as you can see. And this cone is one of the few that didn't open during the fire. And these cones are often called, the scientific term for it is serotinous cone, and that just means it's closed, a closed cone. So normally all of these cones would be sealed tight and closed like this one. But during intense heat, the resins or sap that keep them sealed closed will soften and the cones pop open and they release lots and lots of seeds. And so then after a fire moves through, and germinates the seed bed and returns nutrients to the soil, it's prepped and ready. Not good? Okay.
We're rolling?
All right, Sharon. So, can you tell me what we're looking at with the pine cone?
So this here is a Table Mountain pine, actually the top of a tree that fell down during or after the wildfire. And what we have these are serotinous cones, is the scientific name for it, and that just means closed cone. And that's a really neat fire adaptation that these cones have.
And how is it that these closed cones open up with the fire? What's the science behind it?
So the science behind these closed cones is that they are sealed up with resin or a type of sap, normally that protect the seeds. And then when an intense fire or intense heat moves through the forest, that loosens or softens that sap, and the cones pop open and they release tons of seeds to a ready-made seed bed that the fire has cleaned up and put new nutrients into.
And can you tell us and show us the seedlings that we have here?
And so you can see in front of me, there are several 1 to 2 year old seedlings that most likely came from this treetop after the fire rolled through and the cones popped open. There are all of its children there, and there are tons of them all over this ridgetop now.
And how soon after the seeds germinate do we see these?
Right after the cones pop open and the seeds hit the seed bed, that next growing season, we saw, with this fire, we saw seedlings popping up right in the beginning of spring. So not too long. It didn't take very long.
And can you tell us a little bit about some of the charred, like bark? Can you tell us some of the? Can you tell us about some of the like charred trees around us? Is this a good place to do that?
Let me
Tell-
show you
tell
on
us
that
what-
one.
Okay.
Oh, do you?
Tell us what we're looking at there as soon as we get. Are we hearing some other noise out there? Yeah, okay.
I'm,
So just tell Manali about what it is that you're.
I don't really
Yeah,
know
the
what
next-
pine tree this is. It's a pine
Yeah.
that came down. I don't know that it would be as meaningful as
That one.
that
Okay.
one.
Okay. I think
Is that okay?
I think that's
good?
fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, you rolling?
Sharon, can you tell us about the little seedling we have over there?
So you can see this little seedling here. This is in its first year, and so most likely, well, let me start that over. This is a 1-year seedling that we have here, also from the Table Mountain pine. And a year after the fire, that first growing season, a lot of the seedlings looked like this, and they were kind of popping up all over the forest floor on this ridge top. And then we have 2-year seedlings. You can see there's a much size difference. These got a head start ahead of this little guy.
Okay, and then there's another thing I'd like to do is you've talked a lot about the ash and the nutrients that went into the soil. Is there any kind of loose soil here? Certainly around here I can feel it, where you could pick up a handful of it and talk about like what the fire contributed to that handful of soil.
Okay.
I mean, is there something you can grab there that would be a good example of it?
Yeah, is
Yeah.
is that good?
Yeah, but don't grab it yet.
Okay. Put it back.
So when Bob and Rob are ready, let us know.
Ready? We're rolling?
Can you tell us about some of the changes that happened with the soil right after the fire?
So as a fire moves through, there are a lot of changes in the soil.
Let's stop. I got your head there.
Oh, okay.
And we're rolling?
So can you tell us about some of the changes with the soil right after the fire?
So when a fire moves through, there are a couple things that change with the forest floor in general. Couple things that change in general.
You wanna start again?
Yes,
That'd be great.
this is going to take me a little bit to get my thoughts together. I want to talk about the reduction of
We were talking earlier
duff.
about nutrients, and so I
Yeah.
think that's kind of maybe the theme of the story here in terms of the beneficial effects of the fire on the soil. Is that I think didn't you tell us that it's putting
It
nutrients
Releases
ash.
carbon back into the soil.
Rolling.
So you were telling us that the fire brought some nutrients to help some of the ecosystem flourish. What changes did it do for the soil?
So when a fire moves through the forest, it breaks down the duff layer, which is made up of sticks and twigs and dead leaves. And the fire will actually consume some of that, not always all of it. Only really intense fire would consume that. But when it breaks down that duff layer, it releases carbon and puts it back into the soil and provides a lot of nutrients for the next generation of plants to be popping up.
That was good.
Okay.
Got it.
Rolling?
So can you tell us what we're seeing here?
So this is a characteristic of a fire-adapted pine like Table Mountain or pitch pine. They will actually, after a fire moves through, kind of have resprouts of new needles all along the stem of the trunk of the tree. And again, the scientific term for this is epicormic branching. And it's very characteristic of being adapted to fire, and it's just kind of a flush of needles after a fire rolls through. And another characteristic you see here is this flaky bark. And so you can see it easily sloughs off. And that's another way that these pines are ready to handle even in a fairly intense fire that rolls through. They can kind of shrug it off with that light flaky bark. The outside will char and the rest underneath is fine.
Are we good with that?
Could you maybe flake just like a little more bark?
Oh, a little more bark?
Flaky.
or at least point to it. At least point to
Right
it.
here?
Yeah. Cool.
Should have got a manicure.
Rob,
Just kidding.
what do you think about doing a
Let me adjust my exposures a little bit.
And actually, can I ask one more question about the branches once they're done with their?
Good.
I was just like, how does the fire?
We're rolling.
So how does the fire actually allow these branches to grow?
So when a fire will roll through this natural community, these branches are not here. And then a little bit of the stress of the fire, charring the outside and burning off some of the needles, the tree kind of responds. It's another regenerative response that once the fire's passed through, it will sprout out more needles just to help it continue produce chlorophyll and keep itself going. And so it's just a quick response to make sure that if some needles were charred and burned away, it's got more to go.
And what exactly is chlorophyll?
Chlorophyll is a chemical that's produced by any plant that is absorbing the sunlight, and then it uses that to make sugar and provide itself nutrients.
Thank you.
Stay right there. Action. And action. Do name and everything, please.
Okay. Could you say your name and your position?
My name is Thomas Craig. I'm the North Carolina State Parks Fire Management Officer.
And what do you do here?
I oversee the State Parks Fire Program.
Great. In regards to the 2016 fire, what was your experience with that?
Yeah, so with the 2016 fire, my role in that position was actually getting resources to the parks that needed it. So in 2016, we had two wildfires going on simultaneously. We had the Chimney Rock fire, the Party Rock fire, and then we had the South Mountain fire, which is the Chestnut Knob fire that we're at today. And so my role was getting resources to both fires.
Can you describe the fires, how big they were, and
Yeah, so for us, Chestnut Knob was the largest fire we've ever had in the state park system. It's me.
All right, we're rolling.
if you could say your name and your position?
I'm Thomas Craig. I'm the Fire Management Officer for the North Carolina State Parks.
And what do you do here?
I oversee the State Parks Fire Program. So the State Parks has a prescribed fire program, and so majority of my job is overseeing prescribed fires, but on occasion when we have wildfires, I oversee wildfire projects too.
And regarding the 2016 Chestnut Knob fire, how was your experience with that? Had you ever seen something like that before?
Yes, I have seen stuff like that before, never in North Carolina. So as my position as a fire management officer, I'm a national resource for fire, so I've seen that level of severity in different parts of the country, but never in Western North Carolina.
And could you describe the fire?
The fire was very complex. It was tough. One of the problems that we had with the fire was the lack of resources. We had two fires going on simultaneously with the Chestnut Knob fire, one at Party Rock which we oversee, and that's that Chimney Rock State Park. And one of the problems we had was we had to get resources to Chimney Rock. Chimney Rock was a more complex fire. It had structures, thread,
All right,
and
let's stop rolling.
Could you describe the Chestnut Knob fire and how big it was?
yeah, the Chestnut Knob fire was around 6,000 acres. About 5,000 acres of the fire was actually on state park property, and about 1,000 acres that was off state property. So it encompassed a large area, the largest wildfire we've ever had in the state park system.
How big is it compared to the state park? How much of it did it consume?
So the state park's around 20,000 acres, and so it consumed about a quarter of the park property.
And regarding the firefighter effort, how did that look and what had to happen in order to get it under control?
So with the firefighting effort, with Chestnut Knob, it was low priority in the state. So in 2016, we had a lot of wildfires going on at the same time. And in the state park system, we also had another wildfire going on at Chimney Rock State Park, the Party Rock Fire. The Party Rock Fire was the higher priority fire, so we had to send the majority of our resources to Chimney Rock to assist with that firefighting effort. And so as far as Chestnut Knob goes, we were actually only working with local resources. So we had the park staff, we had the local county staff with the North Carolina Forest Service, but we were very limited in the resources we could get here.
And do you know how many firefighters had to come in or where they came from in order to stop the fire?
Yeah, I think eventually we had over 500 people coming in and out of the park to fight the fire.
And how did you feel in your position, your job, when you got this news and you had to control it and that kind of?
With my position, it's kind of routine. You get a call, you respond, and so with this, the fire wasn't a surprise to us. We had a significant drought in western North Carolina. So as fire practitioners, we were looking at this drought saying, we need to be ready. We need to get our brush trucks ready to go. Our staff needs to be ready to suit up at a moment's notice. So when I got the call, it was just kind of a routine call. Okay, we got a fire. What was not routine was the size and scale of the fire. So generally we pack up for 2-week assignments on a fire, and I packed up for 2 weeks and was here for 2 weeks.
How long did it actually take to get to stop?
To actually get containment on the fire, to keep forward progress, it took us about 2 weeks. Overall, with mop-up operations and cleanup, well, the incident management teams start to finish was about 3 weeks, and then recovery efforts are probably still ongoing.
And are you worried about this happening again? Or do you have anything in place to prevent a huge fire like this from happening?
So North Carolina State Parks is used to having wildfires. We have wildfires every 5 to 10 years within the state park system. What we're not used to is managing multiple fires at the same time. So one of the things that we're working on in the state park system is how do we create more capacity? We can deal with one, but can we deal with 2 or 3? And so one of the problems we had in 2016 were we had 2 fires at 2 different parks. What would happen if we had a 3rd park on fire or a 4th park on fire, and what would be our capacity needs for that? So my job is to try to get as many staff trained, qualified, and certified to deal with the fires.
And in regards to how small or big a fire is, do you want to keep small fires, or when do you want to contain a fire?
Well, generally you want to contain a fire as soon as possible if there's values at risk. And so basically in the fire profession, it's firefighter safety and protecting the public. And so we have to protect the public. So whenever there's any public at risk, we have to go 100% suppression on that fire. Now where there's wiggle room, where there's no values at risk, then we can manage those fires for larger acreages, but we can't put the public at risk.
And regarding planned or prescribed fires, when do you do those and how often do you do those?
So the state park system, we have a pretty aggressive fire program. We're burning on average 20 to 30 different state parks a year, about 6,000 acres on average a year. So we have a pretty active prescribed fire program, and we burn year round.
I think that's all
So yeah, or I guess just generally like so you talked about the logistics of like moving forward and like dealing with the next fire, but like just like his perspective as an expert, like his personal the state of preparedness, but his like.
Okay.
We're still rolling.
About the cause of the fire. Like, they know it's the cause. How do they know it's the cause?
Okay. Okay. Are we good?
Yep.
Okay. Regarding how the fire started, so we know it was human caused, but how do you know that, and do you know where it started?
As far as I know, it's under investigation. So sorry, I didn't answer the question. So as far as how the fire started, it's under investigation. And as far as I know, we do not have a conclusion of how it started. Last time I talked to the investigator, that they couldn't find any clear reason for how the fire started.
And regarding your feeling about being prepared for another wildfire, do you feel in your position that you guys are prepared? And I guess what your feelings are towards it.
Yeah, as far as feeling prepared for the next round of wildfires, I feel that we are a lot more prepared for the next fires. So every time we have a fire within the state park system, we do an internal review, what we call an after-action review. Within that after-action review, we look at our program, we take a long, hard look at our program and say, what do we need to fix? What do we need to do better next time? And so we took about a year to generate a report for our 2016 wildfires. And really what we're trying to do is build from the 2016 wildfires, how do we build the program better? And so I feel that we're equipped better now for the next round of wildfires than we were before.
Could suppressing a fire earlier result in hotter blazes later on?
Yeah, so as far as fire suppression goes, you're accumulating fuels every year. And so as the duration from the previous fire goes on longer and longer, that the intensity of that fire is going to go up because your fuels keep going up.
And was that the case here? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so as far as South Mountains with our fuel accumulation, South Mountain State Park has a riddled fire history. So we've had previous fires in the South Mountain Range. In the 80s, there was a pretty significant fire that ran through the South Mountain Range, and it led to a large buildup in the state for resources. And so as far as the buildup of fuels is actually, it's moving quicker than our resources are actually like being established within the state to respond to the fires. So our fuel accumulation's going up, and so our blazes are getting hotter and bigger, and it's going to require more resources.
Tell us what it means by fuel.
What are you referring to when you say fuels?
Yeah, so as far as fuels in the wildland, we're dealing with sticks, twigs, leaves, pine needles, logs, so any vegetation that will actually burn. So you got live vegetation and dead vegetation.
Did we miss anything? Is there anything else, I guess, like pertinent to the story that you think people should know about?
Is there anything you guys think we should talk about?
Something that I wanted to say in my piece that I didn't get, or I didn't do, was I wanted to end with a note about how wildfires are bad for people, but no fire is bad for the forest. The best way to deal with that is prescribe fire. Right?
Rolling?
Can you talk about how forest fires can be harmful to public people, but how they're beneficial for the forest?
Yeah, so as far as forest fires go, small fires in the forest we're able to easily contain, and so they don't really cause a huge interruption with the public. It's the years that we have these really large, significant fires that it actually causes a lot of health concerns for the public, because we're dealing with long-term drying, our fuels, vegetation are extremely dry, and so there's more vegetation available for combustion, and so with that combustion is smoke, and so we're smoking out more public with the wildfires. And so as far as things that we can do to improve is we need to I screwed this one up, sorry.
It's all right, just sort of from there, what you things you need to improve.
All right, so as far as wildfire control goes, the smoke from a wildfire can be very damaging to the public. And so what we're trying to do with prescribed fire is actually reduce the amount of smoke available to the public. And so wildfires and prescribed fires are actually very vital for the forest. The forest needs fire, and we need fire to run across the landscape. And wildfires are actually going to be more detrimental to the public because there's no factor in the smoke. Where is it going to go? How do I avoid these communities? As far as prescribed fire goes, the prescribed fire is going to take into account for all those factors.
And how is it beneficial for the forest?
So as far as vegetation, so fire actually promotes good trees. And so within North Carolina, we're known as the land of the pines. And so without fire, pine trees aren't going to be able to survive. And so what we're going to see is tree species that are more shade tolerant, less fire tolerant. And so when these species grow up with fire, it's actually going to make it more devastating for fire control because these things will only burn on extreme weather. And so when we have extreme weather and tree species that aren't adapted to fire, we're going to have more intense blazes.
In regards to the community, what was their effort in the whole situation, and what have they learned from the fire?
So I've traveled across the country working on wildfires, and I've never seen the community support that we've seen in Western North Carolina. It was unbelievable what the community came to do. I mean, we were getting water, we were getting food, we were getting supplies. As far as being a first responder, I never had to go anywhere. I went to sleep and I went to the visitor center to check in, and I had all the food and water and Gatorade that I could possibly imagine and more.
And do you think the community learned anything from the fire?
I think the community learned that at our worst times, we can become the best. And so I think the community really came together and they really fought this fire with us.
Anything else? That was great.
1 second, please. And anytime.
When controlling the fire, did you use any fire retardants?
As far as controlling the fire, we did not use any fire retardants in suppressing this fire.
So no airplanes came over?
No follow-up.
And dropped
So
retardant?
we had
No?
heard that there were airplanes that were dropping, at least like a little bit, maybe not a lot, but
Is there any airplanes here? There were at
Yeah, I guess we did have the seats for one day.
We had,
But it
we
wasn't
had
much.
Oh,
and
should
the
I?
tanker over on the
I didn't know how to.
Did we end up getting the air tanker? Okay, so maybe I'm wrong. All right, we can do that over
Should we
again.
start
There was some, I didn't see it drop, but I was on the track
we-
one day when we went through and I could see it on the
Here we go.
Well,
Rolling.
Let's ask Kara, let's let Kara ask the question.
Oh, good. When you were controlling the fire, did you use any fire retardants?
Yeah, as far as suppressing the fire, we did use single engine air tankers and a large tanker for 1 or 2 days on the assignment. And so we did use a little bit of paint, what we call it, on the fire, which is surfactant.
And what does that do?
Yeah, so as far as what we call it paint is that we're actually painting the trees, so from above that and below that we can see where they actually put the surfactant.
And will that have any effect on the wildlife or the plants?
Yeah, as far as effect from the surfactants, they are all tested and they all have to meet national standards, and so they do not actually have any long-term impacts on the environment.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do you want, keep talking to her.
Okay.
And we're rolling.
When you look at the stump, what do you see?
Well, this stump is really fascinating. So after just walking in the woods for a little bit, what I've noticed was this actually has a fire scar on it. So this this is an indicator that this tree actually saw quite a bit of fire. And so what we're looking at is there was a lot of fire, and all of a sudden there was no fire within this landscape. So just looking at this tree, it's telling me that there was a lot of fire on this landscape, and then there was a large period where it was absent.
I mean, the one thing that maybe, if we just take that by itself, is we say a lot of fire, you mean in the distant past, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's so old, so it's hard for me to put some
How long
dates
ago
on there.
was?
I can go on a general estimate of what everything in the country is. So.
Yeah. Why don't you go just to tell Kara like what that scar tells you about the history of this area, if you can.
Yeah.
Rolly?
Okay, yeah, looking at this stump, what this is telling me is that there was a lot of fire within this tree's history. And so there's several periods that it actually burned quite a bit, and then it appears that there's a period of fire suppression. And on average, nationally, it's been about 100 years since we enacted a total fire suppression. And so this stump is telling me that this tree kind of lines up. There was a period of a lot of fire, and there was a large period with an absence of fire.
And what is the bottom part of the stump tell you as you look down?
Yeah, so looking at the bottom part of this stump right here, you can see an open cat face. And so this tree's been dead for quite some time now. It was probably dead before the fire, but this open cat face is from a series of fires just keeping it open.
Let's do that again, Teresa. Go ahead and get down. Position.
And maybe Rob, do you want to get a little more to your right so you can look
Am I in the
that?
shot? Am I in the shot, Bob?
No, you're good.
So to tell Kara again what you're seeing there.
Yeah, so looking at this tree stump right here, it looks like there's an open cat face, and this cat face is generally caused by fire in a series of fires. And so this tree was probably dead prior to the fire, but what it's telling me is that it's seen quite a bit of fire, and that's what kept this open. So every time a fire runs through here, it actually creates a mark, and it allows us as fire managers to understand how many times this landscape actually burned.
All right, here we go. And we're rolling.
Can you tell us what we see here?
Yeah, so what I'm looking at here is this is a chestnut oak, and when a fire comes through here, the flame lengths and the flame heights are really low, and so you see a little bit of char in here. But what that char does is when the fire comes through here, it actually does some damage to the bark, and so over time it peels that bark away and actually creates a fire history of that tree. And so if we were to cut a sample out of this tree, it would actually tell us how many times that it actually had seen fire in the past.
Yes, that's good.
Good. We're rolling.
So where we are right now, what survived and what didn't?
So we're standing here on a ridge right now, and it's looking like it's a pine oak heath, and so it's a mixed pine, and it's got blueberry understory. And so what I see here is that this community actually had Virginia pines growing up in it, and Virginia pines don't generally grow up on these ridges unless there's been fire suppression. And so what I see from the reintroduction of fire from the wildfires, that the Virginia pines have died in the fire. Then you look at the chestnut oak. The chestnut oak is surviving, and then we have Table Mountain pitch pine that are actually mixed in there too.
And why are some surviving and why is the foreign plant not surviving?
Yeah, so the reason why that there was survivalship is that the pines and the oaks and hickories were actually fire adapted, so they're pyrophytic. And as far as the Virginia pines, the maples, the tulip poplars, we call them mesophytic. They're not fire adapted.
Okay. Pardon?
High throw. Rolling.
I was just explaining that the leaf litter, the dust.
Go right ahead. Roll.
So what do you see at the bottom of the tree?
Yeah, so this is really neat right here. So what I'm looking at is this is actually where the leaf litter was prior to the fire. And so we're looking at about half a foot of leaf litter that actually got consumed in the wildfire. So in this, it burned it straight down to bare mineral soil. You can see from here to there.
Can you explain what leaf litter is?
Yeah, so as far as leaf litter goes, it's just an accumulation of just all the leaves on the ground. So right here we've got 2 seasons worth of leaves, and to get up to here, you're looking at 50 to 60 years without fire to build up that high.
Did you say 50 or 60 or 15 or 60?
50 to 60.
50 to 60. Wow.
Wow, that's crazy.
Are you
That's
good, Rob?
cool.
Do you need anything else?
That's really
Very
very visual.
I think,
Yeah, that's incredible.
yeah, even like feeling it. It's great. That's great. Thank you.
Action. Perfect.
Great. So I guess first things first, could you introduce yourself and spell your first and last name?
I'm Lenore Workman, LENOREWORTMAN.
Okay. And I understand that you're involved with an organization based locally that supports the park. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it's the Friends of the South Mountain State Park, and we are a nonprofit organization, 501(c), and we were established, I believe, 8 years ago, and we support the park in trying to financially help. For instance, the last Saturday in September for the last 4 years, we have sponsored Nature Day, and we try to help. We have money that will buy lunch for all of the volunteers that work, and we have to buy supplies and advertisement for the park. And we really enjoy just helping. Right now, our main project is we're going to try to raise money to buy a excavator, a small one that they can use to work on a trail. But whatever the park feels like, is a need that the state cannot meet, we try to help out.
I know it's challenging. Really look at Rob the whole time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just feel.
But that's great. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. And what is your role within that organization?
I'm the treasurer of the Friends of the State Park of South Mountain.
Great. And could you talk about why the community felt the need to start that?
Yes. In my younger years, we used to date riding the old CC road on the top of the mountain, and people used to hunt on the mountain. And when Pine Mountain moved in and bought land and cut off the access to the CC road, then a lot of people were very concerned because they always thought of the South Mountain Range, this area of the South Mountain Range, as their home or their land. And it was just a Sunday afternoon tradition for many people to drive through and look for wildlife and enjoy the mountains and the streams. And when Pine Mountain started buying up some land and cut off the access, we first organized in '75 to get the game lands that was originally right here was game lands, and we organized to get that turned into a state park, and then parks just grown and grown.
Got it. So the reason why the park exists is partially because of your organization.
Well, not Friends, because we only was established 8 years ago. It was basically community involvement. Everybody wanted to make sure they would have access to the park. And they just enjoyed the mountains and, wanted to let their children and grandchildren have access to it.
Got it. So it wasn't the organization, but community members organized to get the park built to start off with.
Yes. And the Nature Conservative helped a lot, and a different organization that just felt like conserving our natural resources was a very important step to take.
Got it. And can you talk maybe a little bit more about...
Rob,
Yeah.
just be a little bit careful about not stepping on the end of her bike.
Got it. Yeah.
Wait just a second. We're good.
Could you talk a little bit more about what this park means to the community?
Well, it's just, like I say, a family tradition. The park has long been access to the woodlands, and although a lot of people live in the community, they might live in a small little town like Kaiser or Bellwood or Toluca or Conley Springs. And many of them were raised, the older people my age were raised on rural farm area, but then as the jobs disappeared, their farms disappeared, and so they didn't have as much access to nature, and they loved bringing up their children and grandchildren into the park and to the falls. The falls is our #1 attraction here, High Shoals Falls, and I hope you got to see it yesterday. But it's our main attraction, and everybody wanted to take their children and grandchildren, girlfriend, whatever, to the falls to see it. And fishing, there's wonderful fishing here, trout streams, and they just, as well as hunting. And then when it turned into a park from game land, they couldn't hunt, but that didn't seem to bother them. There's game land around the park that comes into back up to the acreage of the park. But it's just lovers of nature is basically why the park came into existence.
Great. Could you talk a little bit more about your personal history here?
Well, like I say, I used to date on Sunday afternoons. We'd come up and ride over the old CC Road, and it was built in the 1920s, and it was basically a fire break and to just give local people in the Depression a job. And I rode horses. I've rode horses here for, I hate to tell you my age, but well over 40 years I've ridden horses in the park. And my husband and children like to fish and just play in the river. My grandchildren like to play in the river. And just the fact that if you haven't seen the video of the flora and fauna of the park, you need to watch it, because there's such a there's such a division of different ecosystems here in the park that's not found in most other places in North Carolina.
Okay. Transitioning now to the South Mountain fire that happened 2 years ago, could you walk me through what your reaction was when that when that disaster first struck?
Well, surprise to start with. It was a pretty day, and then they said there was a fire at the park, and of course I wondered where. And the fact that it got out of hand so quickly because of all of the National Forest Service people said it was just perfect conditions for a wildfire. It was low humidity, had not rained in several weeks, and fall of the year, and a lot of debris on the ground, and it just blew up unbelievably. And we were concerned. There's people around, concerned about being evacuated. They were moving items out of their house up on Pine Mountain and over on the Morganton side. And
So let's just stop for a second here.
rolling?
You might want to just ask a prompt to get Lenore back on track.
So you mentioned that people were concerned and potentially starting to evacuate. Can you just talk more? Yeah.
Okay.
Where you left off.
when the wind changed, and over at Clear Creek, people were really concerned, and the park was concerned. And the atmosphere of the workers, the firefighters, and the staff here at South Mountain changed by each weather report and each fire meeting. And there's 2 days that was just absolutely somber. Everyone was concerned. There's really no laughing or joking. It was just business. And the day that the wind changed back and they had a fire break over at Clear Creek, it was like you stepped into a different world when you came over here, because all of a sudden everybody, the weight was lifted off of everyone's shoulders. And mainly what I did, I helped organize food preparation for the firefighters. The amount of calories that they are required to eat during their 12-hour shifts is unbelievable. And they would come in very tired and hungry and cold and wet, and it was really made you have a good feeling to know you had a hot meal ready for them. And the community support during the forest fire, I cannot tell you how touching it was to see the community come together, and then even people in the state come together. We had people from Winston-Salem coming up to bring trailer loads of water and supplies. And the community, it was just unbelievable, the support, and they'd say, what can we do? And if the firefighters, we had no idea, chapstick and socks. I'd never thought about socks. And they said, we need socks. We put it on our website, and in less than 3 hours, we had tons of socks coming in, bags of socks coming in. And we did not have to ask for socks again. Cough drops and hard candy. You just don't think about things like that. We were just mainly, I was just concerned with hot meals. And then as they would come in, they had mentioned some eye drops. They needed eye drops. And so it was just, anytime we put on the website, or people would call and we'd say, well, yes, there is a need for. And within hours, we'd have that need from the local people. And it was just tremendous.
That's great. We're rolling. So now transitioning to the recovery, what has it been like to see the park regenerate? What's been
Well, it's been a long process to start with, a lot of hard work, and the park staff here did a tremendous job in putting in long, hard hours to just clear the trails to where other people could come in and help drag off debris. But there's a lot of danger, and the trees might fall, and there's a lot of big holes in the ground, in the trails, where tree stumps had actually burnt holes into the trails. And it was we also had a lot of support for volunteers to come out and do trail work. And this park is not flat land. It's steep mountain land, the majority of it. Now, I don't want to tell anybody not to come, because we've got some wonderful trails that are very easy at the river. But if you're going to go up on the lookout or at the falls, it's very steep. And so trail volunteers know what they're in for, and they work, very hard. And I cannot say enough for them. Matter of fact, Monday, I believe it was, earlier this week, we had volunteers up here working to clean trails once again. And it's a continuous job, but right after the fire, it was just enormous. And I've got to go back and tell you one thing I didn't mention about the state foresters and the National Forest Service. They were just extremely nice. I have never seen more appreciative people in my life. And they were always very complimentary and of the park and of our staff that helped them. So I want to say, great job to the North Carolina Forestry Service and the National Forestry Service. We couldn't have done any, this blew up and got out of our hands. The local fire departments got on it real quick, but with those conditions, it was just hard to contain it.
How long was it before you could come back to the park and start using it again?
Well, I don't know. I can't remember. It was several, I think 2 or 3 months. I'm not positive exactly how long. It might have been longer than that, Rob, because it was spring. I know they finally got some trails open. They had to keep the Shiny Trail closed the longest, and Chestnut Knob. But they did get the Falls Trail workable and usable, I think, in less than 3 months. But Superintendent Griffith will have to tell you the exact date. I don't know.
Got it. That was great. But could you go back, and at the start you said it was like 2 or 3 months. But could you include the question you answered? Just say that one more time.
Now, pardon?
If you could. So at the start of your response, like that was great. But you mentioned that it was 2 or 3 months, but you didn't say you didn't say what. So could you just go back?
Oh, before the trails were open.
Yeah, or just say like it was 2 or 3 months before I was able to come back, or
Okay,
whatever your
okay.
response was. Just
All
include
right.
that question in there.
Okay.
Just say that again.
All right. Well, it was after the forest fire. It was 2 or 3 months before you could get back into the park. I think it was 3, but I'm not positive on that. But they did open up the High Shoals and the Hemlock Trail and the Cicero Branch Trail first, because they had very little damage. But the trails on the mountain was, I think it was closer to the spring before they were open. But I'm not absolutely positive about that. But the general public could come back in, I think 3 months after the fire, but I'm not, it might have just been 2, I'm not positive.
Great. Obviously, since the fire happened, a couple years have passed. Trees are starting to come back. Can you talk about what it's like to see that regeneration?
Well, heartwarming. They had to change some trails, and because of the potholes and things the fire caused. But it's just, you're elated when you go up. Many people are still very surprised at the damage when they walk it. But it's just a joy to see that the park has came back to basically its original state.
We've been talking with some of the park staff about how fires can be very beneficial for the ecosystems. Are you aware of that, or have you heard of that at all?
Yes. I've observed some of the burning, the burning by permits, and I know blueberries, huckleberries. The old people that lived on my side of the mountain, they used to burn the fire. They used to set fire and watch the mountain, and it was to make the huckleberries grow. And also they used to say it was to get rid of the rattlesnakes. Now, we don't know about the rattlesnakes, but we do know that it would regenerate the huckleberries, blueberries, native blueberries. And also my husband's grandma used to say, well, this used to give us something to look at, which surprised me to no end. But, they were old mountain people, and they knew when to burn to where it would not get out of hand. But yes, it rejuvenates. There's a bare oak species here in South Mountain Park, and it's not found very throughout the state very much, and it has to have fire to regenerate.
Great. And do you feel like that's common knowledge among the people around the park?
I would say 50% of the people, or maybe even 70 that live right here in this community know that. But the people in downtown Morganton, I don't think it's probably common knowledge. But now I remember when I was in high school, we studied that in biology, so maybe they still do, I don't know.
Great. And I guess now shifting to looking forward to the future, what are your feelings about the potential for like another big fire coming through?
I think it's very slim. They do have control burns, and they also, you know, even the National Forest Service said you could not have planned a more perfect season for an out of control forest fire. And that was just a fluke in nature. And I doubt, now we might have a very small fire by lightning, but we're not, you know, you never know. But as far as it getting out of hand and as large as it did, very, very small chances of that ever happening. Again.
I think you've covered just about anything. You might just ask her if there's anything else.
Yeah, do you feel like there's anything else that we should know, like associated with this fire and the recovery?
Well, I think it made a lot of people more aware that we have a South Mountain State Park. Many people in the adjoining counties and some people in Burke County didn't have any idea South Mountain Park existed. And it's mainly because we're in such a rural location, and it's not the easiest of parks to get to as far as roads are concerned. And here again, we have a lot of very strenuous trails. So, but the easy, and we have a handicap accessible trail. And I think it did publicize the park and let people be more aware. Number one, how big the park is. Number two, how close it was. Because in the surrounding communities, I heard, I didn't go, but I heard that at night there'd be places in the community that people would go to watch the fire on the mountain.
So you feel that overall, you feel like the fire was an overall positive for the park?
No, I don't feel like overall it's positive whatsoever. It's scary, it was dangerous, lives were threatened, and I don't think it was positive whatsoever. My opinion, that's only my opinion. But, you know, in the long run, North Carolinians are resilient, and people up here are tough mountain people, and it, you know, we recovered, and there is some positive aspects of it happening, but let's just pray it doesn't happen again.
I think we got a lot.
Yeah.
Okay,
A
good.
lot of great stuff. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, you got your back to me. Wait for me, please. I've got to say act. I'll say action. Okay, sorry.
I didn't know we were in the big time.
Here we go, and action. Action.
Giving you my best side,
Yeah, and give me a little more.
frontage.
A little more.
Okay.
Ready, action. Action. Open that up again. Good. And have it read it. Action. Action.
Could you, just so I can get the sound levels right, could you tell me what you had for breakfast?
I don't remember what I had for breakfast.
Perfect. That was enough. You got it.
Okay, and then when you're answering, if you could just answer kind of with the question embedded in the answer as well,
I'll try.
as much as you can. But and could you just introduce yourself?
My name is Jonathan Griffith. I'm the park superintendent at South Mountain State Park.
Great. And about the fire in 2016, kind of describe the fire in your own words and how it started.
Okay. The fire in 2016 here at the park started after about 2 months of drought. So we had been really dry for a long time. Got the call about 8 o'clock from EOC, Emergency Operations Center. There was actually a wildlife spotter plane flying around and saw the blaze from a county or two over and came to investigate. And so that was the way it was called in to us. So it took us, once we got on scene, of course it was hard to find because we live in the mountains and it's not really easy to spot stuff. So it took us probably 3 hours or so to actually locate the fire, and then another hour and a half to access it once we saw where it was. So it was pretty late in the evening by the time we actually got on scene. Time we were there, it was already 15 to 20 acres in size in an extremely treacherous area along Chestnut Knob Trail, which is pretty much inaccessible to vehicle. So it was all foot trail. By the time we got around it and assessed it, it was about 4 in the morning, I think. So we stopped till morning, till daylight, and came back in and started trying to put fire line around it.
And can you go into a little more detail in the process of controlling it and the firefighter effort and that kind of thing?
Okay. As far as in general for fires in that type of environment where it's just too steep to get a bulldozer or any other kind of equipment, you have to put in what's called hand line. And basically it's just a row of firefighters going behind themselves. In this case it was mostly park rangers with hand tools, chopping out down to mineral soil, a place for the fire to come to and hopefully stop. The problem with that is when you're doing it by hand, it's not nearly as large as if you're doing it with a bulldozer line. If you have any kind of wind or any kind of topography, and we had both, it's very easy for the fire to jump across that line. And that's what it did. We put in hand line after hand line, and the fire just walked right across it, just like it was nothing, just because it was too dry and too windy, essentially, and too steep. So you get what's called a roller from steep terrain. So if there's something, an ember or something that falls out of a tree, it'll actually roll downhill, and if it gains enough speed, it'll roll right across your fire line and just start the fire on the other side. And then you just basically got to start over. After, let's see, I guess it was late that first day, we got our first bulldozer in and started cutting bigger line where we could, where topography allowed us to do so. But it was so dry and so windy that the fire walked right across that as well. And we just kept backing up and backing up. We finally wound up with our outermost ring of our trail system as part of the line. Part of that held, part of it didn't. To the north of us, it went right on across that and on towards actually old Highway 18. All total, it burned 6,435 acres over the course of about a month. At the busiest, I think we had just over 300 firefighters on the ground in any one day fighting the fire.
How long did it take to fully stop the fire?
It was just about a month. It started on November 6th, and I think we declared it out on December 4th.
And then, do you have anything, facts or stats about the recovery of the forest?
Well, as far as what the fire consumed, it was almost all park property. It was probably 80% park property. Another 15% was a Foothills Conservancy property, which is property we were getting ready to purchase anyway. So that is either, some of it has already become park and some of it will become park. And then the last 5% was some private property. Some good statistics, we had no injuries during that whole fire, which is almost unheard of, to have that much and that intense firefighting going on without having someone injured somewhere. So that was great. Didn't have any structures damaged other than trail structures like steps and staircases and those kinds of things, primarily on the foot trails. So that was wonderful as well. We had 2 communities that were right in the face of the fire that we were afraid might get burned up. That would be Pine Mountain Estates over to our kind of southeast, and then Baptist Camp Road. which is kind of to our northeast. Both of those, when the wind shifted, were in the path of the fire, but we were able to keep it out of those, thankfully.
And then anything about the business of the state park with the fire and then the recovery of the fire and how it's grown from then?
Um,
I guess in terms of just like visitor numbers or like how
okay.
that was affected by the fire and like where it
Yeah,
stands now.
the park was closed for 2 months. It was closed during the month of the fire, and then we were closed for about a month after that for recovery. All total, during that year, though, we were still up in attendance because it had been so busy prior to that. And of course, November and December are 2 of our slower months, so it didn't hurt us too bad attendance-wise. The local community was so giving as far as coming out money-wise. We probably came out ahead. They fed those 300 firefighters every single day. They donated water. They donated boots and chainsaws and anything you can imagine that would go towards firefighting effort. They came and brought it just day after day after day. Talked to several of the different firefighters because we had firefighters from all across the country. That was historic level drought. We had 20 some odd fires going on just in western North Carolina at that same time. So the North Carolina Forest Service was pretty well tapped out. They were fighting fires everywhere. So they called in federal reinforcements, and the feds basically just call in firefighters from across the country. So we had folks from Alaska, we had folks from New Mexico, all over the state, Pennsylvania, Northeast, Oregon. And to a man, everyone that I spoke with said they had never seen the outpouring of support that this community put forth for this fire. So that was great. But as far as business goes, it really didn't do a whole lot of damage to us. Like I said, we were closed for 2 months. We were working on trails and rehabilitating fire line and that kind of stuff for the next year. But we did that while the park was open, so it really didn't hurt attendance that much. Had a couple of trails, Shiny Trail and Chestnut Knob Trail, that were just literally consumed in places by the fire. The Chestnut Knob Trail in particular had a lot of wooden structure on it. A lot of that burned up. So we wound up completely relocating one section of trail about 1.5 miles long. That took the longest. I think that took us about 1.5 years by the time we finally finished it, because we were doing all that other rehab work at the same time. Had a little dedication ceremony for that after the fact, and the community came out and was happy for that. And that pretty much signified the end of the rehabilitation efforts. As far as the environment itself, fire is needed, frankly. We do prescribe fires from time to time here in the park when the conditions are right, certainly not under the drought conditions that were happening at that particular time. But the environment will come back, and already is. It's showing good signs of rebounding. A lot of places that you looked at up there are just like we did a prescribed burn. Cleared out the understory just like we would hope for, left a lot of the large trees, did what fire does. We have a lot of fire-dependent species in the park, Table Mountain pine, pitch pine, Fothergilla, turkeybeard, all those kinds of things that just thrive on having fire happening in the park. So those kinds of things rebounded very well. And if you go up and take a look around, you'll see lots of plants and flowers and that kind of stuff coming back up in the understory. There were places that burned completely out, the chimneys, the steep hollows where wind just funnels, steep ridges and stuff where you would expect for it to get really, really hot, did, and killed a lot of the trees up there. But that just opened up some vistas and makes more of a mosaic for the natural communities. So, all in all, the park's doing just fine.
So you've kind of touched on this a little bit, kind of like throughout the interview, but just kind of like in maybe like one or like several sentences, could you touch on like the lasting impacts of the fire? Like was it a big deal? Like was it not like a big deal in the end of the day? Like, you know, just this lasting impacts.
Environmentally, at the end of the day, it was a good thing, all in all. Like I said, we do prescribe burning, but we do it on a much smaller scale. So this was a chance to get a lot more burning in, actually. I wouldn't say a chance, but it got in a lot more burning than what we would normally do on average when we were setting them ourselves. So all in all, plant community-wise, it's a good thing. There's nothing really in the South Mountains that's not appropriate for occasional prescribed burning. So that got taken care of with a wildfire instead. The unfortunate thing was the timing, the fact that it happened in the fall, during leaf fall, so every time you got something put out, new leaves would fall down on it, and we would start right back up that next night, so you couldn't get it to stay out, essentially. And then the historic level droughts, it burned a lot deeper into the ground than what a normal prescribed burn would have done. But still, all in all, out there, it looks really good. As far as effects on us, of course, we spent a year and a half working really hard to get things back in shape and make things safe on those trails that we used as fire lines. So it was a lot of work, but now it's back just as good as new.
And I've been kind of busy with the camera, so I'm sorry if you touched on this already, but could you talk about like what your job description is and like what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Okay. I'm the park superintendent here at South Mountains, so I'm basically the main administrator of the park. I do the same thing that rangers do. We're all law enforcement officers. We all do park operations. We do resource management. We do programs. We give interviews, do all that kind of stuff, in addition to all the paperwork, doing the budget, doing the hiring, doing the firing, all that kind of thing. You have one of those superintendents typically at each state park. And then in addition to that, we have park rangers, both journey level rangers and advanced level rangers. We have maintenance mechanics, and we have secretaries here that work to keep the park running.
Got it. And one more quick question. Can you describe the emotions that people were feeling when they found out that the fire was hitting and then they found out it was growing? Like what was that like?
Oh, emotions were running very high, very tense, especially for those two communities that I mentioned, Pine Mountain and the Baptist camp, who thought the fire might be coming towards them. But they were very good. They were very respectful. The local fire departments did all of the structure control and protection for those communities. We didn't do any of that. We were concentrating on the field work, and they did an outstanding job. They had all kinds of structure protection policies in place just in case the fire turned and went the wrong direction, and they made the folks in the community feel much more comfortable. Brought in fire trucks from every single department in Burke County and all the surrounding counties as well. So that worked out really well, all told.
Perfect. Anything else you feel like we missed? Or?
I don't think so.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for your time.
It works?
Yeah.
All right.
Very good speaker, too.
Yeah, I don't know about that.
me try one more. Cool.
these are from the previous year.
I don't.
Of that led to?
So we are on a ridgetop that burned very intensely during the Chestnut Knob fire, and the natural community that is common on these dry, high ridgetops is a pine oak heath community.
Why don't we start again?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Ready? Okay.
Re-ask the question, Manal.
Oh, okay. So can you talk to us about the Table Mountain pine and what the burning of these pines led to?
So we're on the ridge. One more
Deep
time.
breath, no big deal, just words. As I said before, oh, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Okay.
Here we go.
You ready? Okay. So we're on this high, dry ridgetop, which is characterized by a natural community called a pine oak heath natural community. The tree species that occur up here are often chestnut oak, scarlet oak, Table Mountain pine, pitch pine. And what we have here is a Table Mountain pine that was alive during the Chestnut Knob fire. But as I said, it was very intense fire behavior that rolled up this ridgetop. And so this tree is adapted to survive. If not the individual tree, its species will survive intense fire behavior. And one of its key adaptations are these pine cones. They are in close to the tree branch, as you can see here, and they're heavily armored, as you can see. And this cone is one of the few that didn't open during the fire. And these cones are often called, the scientific term for it is serotinous cone, and that just means it's closed, a closed cone. So normally all of these cones would be sealed tight and closed like this one. But during intense heat, the resins or sap that keep them sealed closed will soften and the cones pop open and they release lots and lots of seeds. And so then after a fire moves through and germinates the seed bed and returns nutrients to the soil, it's prepped and ready.
We need to stop
Not
here
good?
because we got airplane.
I saw you shake your head. I'm like, oh no!
I'm gonna get.
I'm gonna stand up so my leg doesn't go to sleep.
Yeah.
So let's, talking about all those trees and stuff, probably obviously after we have to see what it is. So I wonder if we should shorten this.
Shorten the
whole.
This segment.
The pine cones and.
Yeah. So I think it would be probably more productive if kind of Manali asked a question, give her a fairly short answer, and more of a dialogue.
Okay.
Then you're having to do like a presentation as if you're speaking to a group of people.
Okay.
So you just talk, basically a one-to-one conversation is what we're looking for.
Okay.
Here. So Manali, why don't you be fairly directive?
Okay, I'll be more specific in my
Okay.
questions.
So stick to the cones and how they regenerate.
Well, I mean, just follow Manali's lead. So Manali's going
Need.
to say
I need so much from you, Shani.
Manali's lead. So she'll say, well, tell me about
Are
these
you
pine
okay?
cones
Were you
here.
good?
Okay.
Tell me about the seedling
Thought you
here.
were. We got plenty of time.
Tell me about this burned out.
But what's great is her hand will match,
Okay. Okay.
which it never
Keep
does.
it short. Okay.
Keep it short.
Okay.
So
I've always had trouble with that, right, Lance? Being brief.
All right. Well, I mean, I think it's kind of a mindset that we're not asking you to do a presentation to a group of people.
Right.
You're just having a conversation with Manali, and
Okay.
she's curious about what we are seeing here, and you're telling her what it is.
Okay. All right, did I move on you? Cone, am I talking too much into the mic?
No, that's why I put it upside down on the other side, because that was another issue I was
You can look at the cone, but after you look at it for
What we're looking at with the pine cone.
So this here is a Table Mountain pine, actually the top of a tree that fell down during or after the wildfire. And what we have are, these are serotinous cones, is the scientific name for it, and that just means closed cone. And that's a really neat fire adaptation that these cones have.
And how is it that these closed cones open up with the fire? What's the science behind it?
So the science behind these closed cones is that they are sealed up with resin or a type of sap, normally that protect the seeds. And then when an intense fire or intense heat moves through the forest, that loosens or softens that sap, and the cones pop open and they release tons of seeds to a ready-made seed bed that the fire has cleaned up and put new nutrients into.
And can you tell us and show us the seedlings that we have here?
And so you can see in front of me, there are several 1 to 2 year old seedlings that most likely came from this treetop after the fire rolled through and the cones popped open. There are all of its children there, and there are tons of them all over this ridgetop now.
And how soon after the seeds germinate do we see these?
Right after the cones pop open and the seeds hit the seed bed, that next growing season, we saw, with this fire, we saw seedlings popping up right in the beginning of spring. So not too long. It didn't take very long.
And can you tell us a little bit about some of the charred, can you tell us some of the, can you tell us about some of the charred trees around us? Is this a good place to do that?
Let me show you on that one.
Okay.
Oh, do you?
Tell us what we're looking at there as soon as we get. Are we hearing some other noise out there? Yeah. Okay. So just tell Manali about what it is that you're.
I don't really know what pine tree this is. It's a pine that came down. I don't know that it would be as meaningful as that one.
Yeah.
So you don't even have to move? All she back Go on down. Okay, good. Yeah, good. You're still out there.
Okay.
Back up just a teeny bit. Good. There you go.
Fran, can you tell us about the little seedling we have over there?
So you can see this little seedling here. This is in its first year, and so most likely, well, let me start that over. This is a 1 year seedling that we have here, also from the Table Mountain pine. And a year after the fire, the first growing season, a lot of the seedlings looked like this, and they were kind of popping up all over the forest floor on this ridge top. And then we have 2 year seedlings. You can see there's a much size difference. These got a head start ahead of this little guy.
Okay, and then there's another thing I'd like to hear is you talked a lot about the soil. Is there any kind of loose soil here? Certainly around here I can feel it, where you could pick up a handful of it and talk about, like, that would be a good example of it?
Yeah, is that good?
Yeah, but don't grab it yet.
Okay. Put it back.
So, when Bob and Rob are ready, let us know, and Manali can ask you a question.
Rob, we're going to have to change, I guess. She's going to have to pick up. Excuse me.
Soil. You've been out with a biologist before.
Rob, can you move back away from the soil?
Soil right after the fire?
So as a fire moves through, there are a lot of changes in the soil. One could...
Let's just stop. I got your hip.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Rob said?
Yeah.
Should I?
Yeah, just go back just a teeny bit.
I need to
That log's kind of in your way.
Yeah, just a little bit. We're working with it though. Let's see. Sorry, where are you going to be picking up the soil?
I can do like right here.
Perfect.
Oh, that's not right. Let me cheat a little bit.
Okay, perfect.
Can you tell us about some of the changes with the soil right after the fire?
So when a fire moves through, there are a couple things that change with the forest floor in general. A couple things that change in general.
You want to start again?
Yes. This is going to take me a little bit to get my thoughts together. I want to talk about.
You might
prompter with this somewhat different prompt, just to get us in a different mode here.
So you were
Ready?
Ready.
Rolling.
So you were telling us that the fire brought some nutrients to help some of the ecosystem flourish. What changes did it do for the soil?
So when a fire moves through the forest, it breaks down the duff layer, which is made up of sticks and twigs and dead leaves, and the fire will actually consume some of that, not always all of it. Only really intense fire would consume that. But when it breaks down that duff layer, it releases carbon and puts it back into the soil and provides a lot of nutrients for the next generation of plants to be popping up.
That was good. You got it.
So can you tell us what we're seeing here?
So this is a characteristic of a fire-adapted pine like Table Mountain or pitch pine. They will actually, after a fire moves through, kind of have resprouts of new needles all along the stem of the trunk of the tree. And again, the scientific term for this is epicormic branching. And it's very characteristic of being adapted to fire, and it's just kind of a flush of needles after a fire rolls through. And another characteristic you see here is this flaky bark. And so you can see it easily fluffs off. And that's another way that these pines are ready to handle even in a fairly intense fire that rolls through. They can kind of shrug it off with that light flaky bark. The outside will char and the rest underneath is fine.
Are we good with that?
Could you maybe flake just like a little more bark?
Oh, a little more bark?
More flaky.
Or at least point to it. At least point to
Right
it.
here?
Yeah. Cool.
Should have got a manicure. And look at all of these branches, right? Like if you get here and look up, they're like all stacked on each other.
And actually, can I ask one more question about the branches once they're done with their...
Roll through this natural community. These branches are not here. And then a little bit of the stress of the fire, charring the outside and burning off some of the needles, the tree kind of responds. It's another regenerative response that once the fires pass through, it will sprout out more needles just to help it continue produce chlorophyll and keep itself going. And so it's just a quick response to make sure that if some needles were charred and burned away, it's got more to go.
And what exactly is chlorophyll?
Chlorophyll is a chemical that's produced by any plant that is absorbing the sunlight, and then it uses that to make sugar and provide itself nutrients.
Thank you.
Stay right there.
Okay, so I think on that.
So, hold on a sec. Okay, so whenever you're ready, start walking.
Okay.
Cool. I'm gonna get another quick shot. Which so we get like one more detail shot.
I don't know if you got this, Sharon. And then one more perspective.
Chestnut oak. Just. Nut oak. Chestnut oak.
Let's see. And go for it.
Sharon, tell us what's interesting about this spot right here.
I'm really thrilled to see, after 2 years after the wildfire, not only second year seedlings regenerating, but also many more brand new seedlings that have popped up this growing season, and we're going to continue to see multiple generations for the next couple of years popping up. So it's a multi-phased process, but it's exciting to see.
And as a biologist, how does it make you feel to see this new life?
It's great to see all this new life popping up. It's not unexpected, but it's fun to see. It's like seeing old friends and new friends too. Good?
Great.
Not too corny.
Amazing.
Sir, are you officially official with what you're wearing? You got to do the hat. That's
They like the hat. They like my dress uniform on.
well, we run this all the time, and we do it when it's like 90-some degrees, and the poor rangers, this is sweating.
Yeah.
We say, got to put your hat back on.
Okay.
Okay. So
When you look at the stump, what do you see?
Well, this stump is really fascinating. So after just walking in the woods for a little bit, what I've noticed was this actually has a fire scar on it. So this is an indicator that this tree actually saw quite a bit of fire. And so what we're looking at is there was a lot of fire, and all of a sudden there was no fire within this landscape. So just looking at this tree, it's telling me that there was a lot of fire on this landscape, and then there was a large period where it was absent.
I mean, the one thing that maybe, if we just take that by itself, is we see a lot of fire. You mean in the distant past, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's so old, so it's so hard for me to put some.
How long ago
dates on there.
was?
I can go on a general estimate of what everything in the country is. So.
Yeah. Why don't you go just to tell Kara like what that scar tells you about the history of this area, if you can.
Yeah.
Rolling.
Okay, yeah, looking at this stump, what this is telling me is that there was a lot of fire within this tree's history. And so there's several periods that it actually burned quite a bit, and then it appears that there's a period of fire suppression. And on average, nationally, it's been about 100 years since we enacted a total fire suppression. And so this stump is telling me that this tree kind of lines up. There was a period of a lot of fire, and there was a large period with an absence of fire.
And what is the bottom part of the stump tell you as you look down?
Yeah, so looking at the bottom part of this stump right here, you can see an open cat face. And so this tree's been dead for quite some time now. It was probably dead before the fire, but this open cat face is from a series of fires just keeping it open.
Let's do that again, please. Go ahead and get down. Is this one?
And maybe, Rob, do you want to get a little more to your right? So we can
Am I in the shot? Am I in the shot, Bob?
No, you're good.
Oh, wait.
So tell Kara again what you're seeing there.
Yeah, so looking at this tree stump right here, it looks like there's an open cat face, and this cat face is generally caused by fire, in a series of fires. And so this tree was probably dead prior to the fire, but what it's telling me is that it's seen quite a bit of fire, and that's what kept this open. So every time a fire runs through here, it actually create a mark, and it allows us as fire managers to understand how many times this landscape actually burned.
Great. Airplane, and that is, what's it called at the base of the tree where the fire is?
The cambium.
Cambium, where it hits
Cambium,
it?
yeah.
Cambium, yeah. And that's, can you find a good example?
Yeah, I got this right here. Oh yeah. Yeah, so what happened was when the fire came through, you can see that
Let's wait till we're set up for this. 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3.
Good. You got really quiet.
Okay, ready to go?
You ready, Mr. Rob?
Yes, I'm
Here
rolling.
we go. Here we're rolling.
Can you tell us what we see?
Yeah, so what I'm looking at here is this is a chestnut oak, and when a fire comes through here, the flame lengths and the flame heights are really low, and so you see a little bit of char in here. But what that char does is when the fire comes through here, it actually does some damage to the bark, and so over time it peels that bark away and actually creates a fire history of that tree. And so if we were to cut a sample out of this tree, it would actually tell us how many times that it actually had seen fire in the past.
Yeah, that's good.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Do you want me to get in there?
He's determined to make me do something dangerous.
I don't think so. There's too many trees.
Yeah, that's kind of my thought.
Yeah. And I don't even know anything. Well, you know one thing. I flew Rob's drone.
Oh, there you go.
It was like, I only did it
Why
for...
don't we have Rob's drone out here then?
Yeah, Rob.
Yeah, Rob.
I should have brought it. I didn't.
What?
Sorry, I didn't mean to
You're
come
killing
on,
me,
Rob.
man. Do you have
I
a
did it for one-
Phantom Pro?
No, it's a Mavic, so it's not as.
That's fine. That's fine.
It's pretty cool.
In fact, it would be better here. It's smaller. It can get through the tree.
1 second, I just moved it forward because
Well,
I didn't want to mess anything.
everything's good as long as your GPS is working. When it's not working, then you're on your own. And that's where you get into trouble.
Yep.
But it's calm.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna do it.
We have one more thing there. I don't know if we need to have
don't say something bad.
No, it's all good.
You're doing really good.
All right, here we go. Looking right here. Turn towards her just a little bit. There you go. And go to your left just a little bit. Perfect. Couldn't be better. Couldn't be better. I wanted that stick to jab you a few times. Sorry about that. Okay, here we go. And we're rolling.
So where we are right now, what survived and what didn't?
Right now, and it's looking like it's a pine oak heath, and so it's a mixed pine, and it's got blueberry understory. And so what I see here is that this community actually had Virginia pines growing up in it. And Virginia pines don't generally grow up on these ridges that died in the fire. Then you look at the chestnut oak. The chestnut oak is surviving, and then we have Table Mountain pitch pine that are actually mixed in there too.
And why are some surviving and why is the foreign plant not surviving?
Yeah, so the reason why that there was survivalship is that so they're pyrophytic, and as far as the Virginia pines, the maples, the tulip poplars, we call them mesophytic. They're not fire adapted.
Okay. Ready? High throw. That'll work.
Yeah.
Did that get
Because you
sciencey?
explained what
What
the
it
other
was.
one was, so I
Yeah.
think that
Yeah,
we can't say it on PBS.
Yeah, right.
Pyrophytic?
Pyrophytic.
You can't say pyrophytic on PBS?
Oh man, you can't be.
Well,
saying-
you know,
Nah, I'm just
they
kidding.
may have to blip it out
We might have
because
to
it's
flip it.
I say fire.
no, it's just a little technical is what we're saying.
He described it though, what it meant.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's, Rob shoot,
I'm gonna be shooting also.
and Bob is too. Bark thickness of.
Yeah, that's another thing that separates from a mesophytic pyrophytic.
Meso, M-E-S-O.
Yeah, MESO.
Oh, hey Bob. Ooh. Okay. Yeah, you can see a little bit. Okay.
Am I in the shot?
Just go right ahead. Roll it.
So what do you see at the bottom of the tree?
Yeah, so this is really neat right here. So what I'm looking at is this is actually where the leaf litter was prior to the fire. And so we're looking at about half a foot of leaf litter that actually got consumed in the wildfire. So in this, it burned it straight down to bare mineral soil. You can see from here to there.
Can you explain what leaf litter is?
Yeah, so as far as leaf litter goes, it's just an accumulation of just all the leaves on the ground. So right here we've got 2 seasons worth of leaves, and to get up to here, you're looking at 50 to 60 years without fire to build up that high.
Great.
Did you say 50 or 60 or 15 or 60?
50 to 60.
50 to 60. Wow.
Wow, that's crazy.
Are you
That's
good, Rob?
cool.
Do you need anything else?
I'm like feeling it, like, yeah, that's great. That's great.
So guys, we want to be back behind the camera. Not in front. You just go with the tree, sir.
I'm just getting a shot of you walking right now. Cool. I think I might actually start right there.
Well, what are you
I'm
doing?
gonna start. I didn't want to run into the tree, so I'll just start
Oh,
walking.
He's starting back there. Okay.
I think yeah, I'll got it.
Yeah, just lift your feet, Bob, so you don't.
Yeah.
There's some rocks. They're right here.
All right, ready? Go.
Ready.
Basically.
So once you get to that stump, go that way.
Yeah.
That'll be an easier one for maybe.
Grab your belt. Here. Okay.
Got it?
All right.
You steer me. Right?
I'm going to just point.
Yeah, just pull it. Go. Where are you going? Yeah.
Right, you ready?
Go. Action. Stand by, please. What's Rob doing? Oh, he's there? Okay.
Oh, he's starting back there.
All right. Begin walking. Go. Okay. Come on back. Action. I want you to stop and look to your left. Look more to your left. Once they go, I want you to look even more to your left, right about here. Ready? Go. Roll down your window all the way, if you would, please. Hold this one too.
Okay.
Thank you.
I don't know how I'm going to get around this rock. I don't know if I can I don't think I can strike.
straddle that. You saw me go over it before, right?
To your right, duck down. Thanks. I'm not blocking your view, right? Are you good?
You're good.
Big dip coming tonight.
Yeah, right.
Yep. Ooh, this is a bad one. The media people made me do it. Like you're running a car. Get things going. That was a bumper. Yeah. Again, we're not walking. Let's keep that.
When you guys were like, well, we can go to the trail. fancy TV crew.
Yeah.
And that is strenuous all day hiking in the backcountry. You drive some, but a lot of it is just walking the gear in, and oh my gosh, those guys carrying the cameras. It's exhausting with just